The conference room fell silent when Carla Roberts stood up, her slight frame barely visible behind the towering figures of seasoned negotiators. "I'll go in," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Around the table, 12 families waited for news of their loved ones trapped inside the embassy. The terrorist leader had already killed 2 hostages. Every protocol said this was impossible. Every expert said she'd never survive. But sometimes, the person everyone underestimates is exactly who you need when the world says there's no hope left. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Brussels as Carla Roberts hurried toward the Crisis Response Center, her messenger bag bouncing against her hip with each quick step. At 27, she looked even younger, standing barely 5'4" with shoulder-length auburn hair that she constantly tucked behind her ears when nervous, which was often. The Crisis Response Center hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Phones rang constantly, keyboards clattered as analysts processed intelligence reports, and senior negotiators moved between briefing rooms like generals coordinating a war. Carla slipped through the main corridor, invisible to most of her colleagues who were focused on more pressing matters than acknowledging the department's junior crisis analyst. She'd been working at the European Union's Crisis Management Division for 18 months, a position she'd earned through a combination of exceptional academic credentials and fluency in 7 languages. Her master's thesis on psychological profiling of extremist groups had earned top honors at Cambridge, but none of that seemed to matter here. In the field of international crisis negotiation, experience trumped education, and at 27, Carla was considered barely out of diapers. Her supervisor, Director Henrik Larsson, was a towering Dane with 25 years of hostage negotiation experience and the scars to prove it. He'd diffused situations in Somalia, mediated prisoner exchanges in Syria, and talked suicide bombers down from ledges in half a dozen countries. Next to him, Carla felt like a child playing dress-up in grown-up clothes. "Roberts?" Larsson called as she passed his office. "Intel analysis on the Prague situation. I need it in an hour." Carla nodded, already mentally shifting gears. The Prague situation involved a disgruntled former diplomat who'd barricaded himself in his apartment with what appeared to be explosive devices. Routine by the standards of their department, but it required careful analysis of the subject's psychological profile and recommendations for negotiation approach. She settled at her workstation, a cramped corner desk squeezed between filing cabinets and a temperamental printer. Around her, senior negotiators like Anton Reyes and Sarah Chen commanded spacious offices with multiple monitors and direct lines to field operations. They were the ones who got called when embassies were attacked, when passenger jets were hijacked, when situations required someone with the authority and experience to make life-or-death decisions. Carla was the one who researched their targets, analyzed communication patterns, and prepared briefing documents that others would use to save lives. Important work, certainly, but always secondary, always supporting, never leading. The Prague analysis came together quickly. Former diplomat Markus Volkov, 54 years old, recently divorced, facing corruption charges that would end his career and possibly land him in prison. Classic profile of someone seeking to regain control through dramatic gesture. Carla's recommendations were straightforward. Approach with empathy, acknowledge his grievances, offer face-saving exit strategy. She submitted the report and returned to her ongoing project, a comprehensive database of international terrorist organizations that she'd been building in her spare time. Nobody had asked her to create it, but Carla believed in being prepared. The official databases were often outdated or incomplete. Her version included psychological profiles, operational patterns, and detailed analyses of communication styles for over 200 groups worldwide. "Working late again, Roberts?" The voice belonged to Chen, one of the department's star negotiators. She paused beside Carla's desk, glancing at the screens filled with terrorist group profiles. "I'm just updating some research," Carla replied, minimizing the windows reflexively. Chen's expression was kind, but patronizing. "You know, there's more to this job than academic research. Real crisis negotiation happens in the field, under pressure, when you've got minutes to make decisions that textbooks can't prepare you for." The words stung because they contained truth wrapped in dismissal. Carla had never been in the field, had never stared down an armed extremist or talked someone back from the edge of violence. Her expertise was theoretical, built from case studies and academic papers rather than lived experience. "I understand," Carla said quietly. "I'm just trying to be thorough." "Thorough is good," Chen replied, "but don't lose sight of the bigger picture. This isn't university anymore." After Chen left, Carla sat staring at her reflection in the darkened monitor. The Crisis Response Center operated on a hierarchy of respect that seemed impossible to climb. Field experience was everything, and without it, she was doomed to remain in the background, analyzing situations while others resolved them. But she continued building her database, studying negotiation transcripts, and learning everything she could about the psychology of crisis situations, because somewhere deep inside, Carla believed that preparation and knowledge might someday matter more than experience and physical presence. She just had no idea how soon that day would come.
The department's monthly briefing took place in the main conference room, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the European quarter. Carla sat in the back row, notebook open, as Director Larson reviewed the previous month's operations. Successful resolutions in Stockholm, Vienna, and Rome. Textbook negotiations that had ended without casualties. The common factor in all successful operations, Larson explained to the assembled team, is experienced field leadership. Crisis negotiation isn't something you can learn from books or simulate in training exercises. It requires someone who can read micro-expressions under stress, who can project authority in chaotic situations, who can physically command presence when facing armed extremists. His eyes swept the room, lingering momentarily on the senior negotiators before moving past Carla entirely. Physical presence matters. When you're face-to-face with someone holding a weapon, they need to see someone they take seriously, someone who looks like they belong in that room. The unspoken message was clear. At 5'4", with a youthful face and nervous habits, Carla didn't look like someone who belonged in high-stakes negotiations. She looked like someone who should be filing reports and organizing briefing materials. After the meeting, she overheard conversations that confirmed what Larson had implied without saying directly. The Prague situation went smoothly. Anton Reyes was telling a colleague. Volkov surrendered after 3 hours of negotiation. Having the right person in the room makes all the difference. Roberts' analysis was spot on. She's got a good analytical mind. Analytical, yes, but analysis only gets you so far. When you're sitting across from someone with explosives strapped to their chest, you need presence. You need them to look at you and instinctively respect your authority. Carla pretended to be absorbed in her phone, but every word cut deep. She'd spent years studying the psychology of crisis situations, had read every major negotiation transcript from the past decade, could identify personality disorders and predict behavioral patterns with remarkable accuracy. But none of that mattered if she couldn't project the kind of physical authority that came naturally to her taller, older male colleagues. The pattern repeated itself in smaller ways throughout the following weeks. When the Marseille incident required immediate response, Larson dispatched Chen and Reyes while Carla remained in Brussels to coordinate intelligence support. When the Munich hostage situation developed, she provided psychological profiles, while experienced negotiators handled direct communication. Her role was always crucial, but invisible, always supportive, but never primary. She was the brain behind the operation, but never the face of it. The breaking point came during a training exercise designed to simulate a terrorist takeover of a government building. Carla had spent weeks preparing detailed profiles of the role-playing extremists, analyzing their constructed backstories and predicting their likely responses to various negotiation strategies. Roberts, Larson announced as teams were assigned, "You'll be coordinating intelligence from the command post. Chen will lead the primary negotiation team." Carla raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, I'd like to request field assignment for this exercise. I've prepared extensively for this scenario." The room went quiet. Several senior colleagues exchanged glances that ranged from sympathetic to amused. Roberts, Larson's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Field negotiation requires someone who can command immediate respect. The role players in this exercise are specifically chosen to be intimidating. They need to see someone who projects natural authority." "But sir, I know their psychological profiles better than anyone. I have identified the optimal approach strategies for each individual." "Which is exactly why you're perfect for intelligence coordination," Chen interjected smoothly. "Your analytical work is invaluable. But when someone's pointing a weapon at you, they don't care about your research. They care about whether they think you're worth listening to." The exercise proceeded with Carla watching from the command post as Chen successfully negotiated the surrender of all role-playing terrorists. Her psychological profiles had been accurate, her strategy recommendations had been followed, and the operation had succeeded largely because of her preparation. But the credit went to Chen, who'd had the presence to execute the plan under simulated pressure. "Excellent work," Larson congratulated the team afterward. "This is why experience matters. Roberts, your intel support was solid, but notice how Chen's natural authority closed the deal." That night, Carla sat in her small apartment overlooking the canal, staring at her collection of crisis negotiation textbooks and wondering if she was fooling herself. Maybe her colleagues were right. Maybe academic knowledge couldn't substitute for the kind of instinctive presence that came with size, age, and gender advantages she'd never possess. But instead of putting away her books, she opened her laptop and continued work on her terrorist organization database, because even if she was destined to remain in the background, she was determined to be the best background support the department had ever seen. She added detailed profiles of 3 more extremist groups, cross-referenced their operational patterns with psychological markers, and updated her analysis of emerging threats in Eastern Europe. By 3 a.m., her database contained more current, detailed information than anything in the department's official files. Carla didn't know it yet, but her obsessive preparation was about to become the difference between life and death for 12 innocent people. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative.
While her colleagues attended high-profile conferences and gave presentations to EU officials, Carla spent her evenings in a different kind of education. 3 nights a week, she drove to a nondescript building in Schaerbeek, where Dr. Elena Vasquez ran private workshops on advanced psychological profiling. Vasquez was a former FBI behavioral analyst who'd left government service to consult for international organizations, and her client list included some of the world's most elite negotiation teams. Carla had discovered the workshops through an obscure academic journal and had been attending for 8 months, paying for the sessions with her own money. The other participants were seasoned professionals from various agencies, most of whom had decades of field experience. They initially treated Carla with polite skepticism, assuming she was someone's assistant taking notes. That assumption lasted exactly 1 session. The subject exhibits classic narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features, Carla analyzed during a case study review. His communication patterns show escalating grandiosity combined with persecution delusions. Traditional authority-based negotiation will trigger his defensive mechanisms. Instead, approach through validation of his perceived expertise. Let him feel like he's teaching you something. Dr. Vasquez raised an eyebrow. Elaborate on the communication patterns you've identified. Carla pulled out her tablet, displaying a detailed analysis she'd prepared. In the first transcript, he uses the word they 47 times in reference to perceived enemies, but never identifies specific individuals. This suggests paranoid ideation rather than concrete grievances. His syntax becomes more complex when discussing his specialized knowledge, indicating that intellectual validation is his primary psychological need. The room went silent. Even the most experienced analysts hadn't caught the syntactical patterns Carla had identified. Furthermore, she continued, his stress responses follow a predictable cycle: initial aggression, followed by intellectual exposition, then emotional vulnerability. If you time your empathetic responses to coincide with the vulnerability phase, you can establish genuine connection rather than tactical manipulation. After the session, Dr. Vasquez approached her privately. "Where did you train? Your pattern recognition is extraordinary." "I'm self-taught, mostly. I've been analyzing negotiation transcripts as a hobby." "As a hobby?" Vasquez looked incredulous. "You've identified behavioral markers that most professionals miss after years of training. What's your day job?" When Carla explained her role at the Crisis Management Division, Vasquez shook her head in apparent frustration. "You're wasted in intelligence support. You should be leading negotiations, not supporting them." But Carla's hidden excellence extended beyond psychological analysis. On weekends, she volunteered at a refugee assistance center in Molenbeek, helping asylum seekers navigate EU bureaucracy. The work had started as language practice, a way to maintain her fluency in Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto. It had evolved into something much more valuable. Many of the refugees she assisted had escaped from regions controlled by the same terrorist organizations she studied professionally. Through careful, respectful conversations, Carla had gathered first-hand intelligence about organizational structures, leadership personalities, and operational methods that weren't available in any official database. She learned that the Crimson Dawn faction preferred female negotiators because their leader had trust issues with men stemming from childhood trauma. She discovered that the Eastern Liberation Front used specific religious phrases as coded communications, allowing their operatives to identify each other in public settings. Most importantly, she developed an intuitive understanding of how displaced populations thought about authority, trust, and survival. None of her colleagues knew about this volunteer work. In the hierarchical world of crisis management, volunteering with refugees might be seen as naive idealism rather than valuable field work. So Carla kept it private, adding the insights to her personal database and using them to enhance her analytical reports. Her linguistic abilities exceeded what anyone at the department realized. Official records showed her as fluent in 7 languages, but that was conservative. Through online tutorials, refugee center work, and obsessive self-study, Carla had developed conversational ability in 12 languages and could understand basic communication in 6 more. She'd learned Kurdish dialects by watching satellite TV feeds from northern Iraq. She'd mastered Chechen through correspondence with displaced families. She could identify regional accents in Arabic that revealed not just nationality, but specific province of origin. These skills had never been formally tested because no one had thought to ask about them. During a recent briefing about tensions in the Caucasus region, Marcus Webb had struggled with interpreting intercepted communications. The translator says this is standard Chechen, but something feels off about the phrasing, he complained. Carla had listened to the audio file and immediately identified the problem. The speaker was using Ingush linguistic patterns while speaking Chechen, suggesting he was either trying to disguise his origin or had learned the language imperfectly. But when Carla had offered this insight, Webb had dismissed it politely. "Thanks, Roberts, but we need to stick with certified translations for official analysis." The certified translation had missed the linguistic deception entirely, leading to incorrect assumptions about the subject's background and motivations. Carla had noted the error in her personal files, but she hadn't pressed the issue. Challenging senior colleagues rarely ended well for junior staff. Her most impressive hidden skill, however, was her ability to predict behavioral escalation. Through thousands of hours analyzing negotiation transcripts, Carla had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize when situations were about to turn violent. She could identify micro-patterns in speech, timing, and word choice that preceded aggressive action. During the Stockholm incident 3 months ago, she'd been monitoring communications from the command post when something in the subject's voice had triggered her instincts. "He's going to hurt someone in the next 5 minutes," she warned the duty officer. "Based on what evidence?" the officer asked. His breathing pattern changed, and he started using past tense when referring to the hostages. He's mentally preparing for violence. The officer relayed her concern to the field team, who'd immediately escalated their negotiation approach. Sure enough, the subject had reached for a weapon before being talked down. The operation had succeeded, but no one had officially credited Carla's early warning. After the Stockholm success, Carla had tried to document her pattern recognition methods, hoping to develop them into formal protocols. But her theoretical approach was too intuitive, too dependent on subtle cues that were difficult to quantify. Her supervisors appreciated her insights when they proved accurate, but they couldn't incorporate them into official procedures. So Carla continued developing her skills in private, studying cases that others missed, learning languages that others ignored, and building expertise that others couldn't recognize. She was becoming one of the most capable crisis analysts in Europe, but only she knew it. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to prove herself worthy of field assignments, she had developed capabilities that far exceeded most of her colleagues. But because those capabilities weren't formally recognized or traditionally demonstrated, they remained invisible to the people who made assignment decisions. Dr. Vasquez had warned her about this during their most recent session. Excellence without recognition is just frustration waiting to happen. You need to find a way to make your abilities visible, or you'll spend your entire career being underestimated. Carla had nodded in agreement, but she'd also wondered if visibility was the real goal. Maybe it was enough to be ready when the moment came, even if that moment never arrived. She was about to discover that the moment comes when you least expect it, and preparation matters more than recognition when lives hang in the balance.
The Ankara embassy crisis began on a Tuesday morning with a routine intelligence briefing that quickly became anything but routine. Carla was reviewing overnight communications when Director Larson burst into the main operations room, his usually composed demeanor replaced by visible tension. "We have a situation," he announced to the assembled staff. "Turkish authorities are reporting a hostage situation at the German embassy in Ankara. Multiple casualties, unknown number of hostages, and the attackers have established communications demanding direct negotiations with EU representatives." The room erupted into controlled chaos as senior staff began coordinating response protocols.
Carla immediately pulled up her database, searching for information about active terrorist groups in Turkey. Within minutes, she'd identified 3 organizations with the capability and motivation for such an attack. "Roberts," Larson called across the room, "I need immediate intelligence on potential perpetrators. Who are we dealing with?" Carla's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up detailed profiles she'd been maintaining for months. Based on the attack profile and timing, 3 primary candidates emerge. The Kurdistan Freedom Coalition has been threatening diplomatic targets since their leader's arrest last month. The Islamic Brotherhood of Anatolia has claimed responsibility for similar attacks in the past year. And there's a newer group, the Sons of Ottoman Glory, that's been trying to establish credibility through high-profile operations. "Which one?" Larson demanded. "Need more information to make a definitive assessment. Communication style, specific demands, number of attackers. These details will narrow the profile significantly." As information trickled in from Turkish authorities, Carla cross-referenced each detail against her database. The attackers had used specific Arabic phrases that appeared in Sons of Ottoman Glory communications. Their demands focused on prisoner releases that matched the group's known objectives. Most tellingly, their operational timing coincided with the anniversary of their founder's martyrdom. "It's Sons of Ottoman Glory," she reported confidently. "I have comprehensive profiles on their leadership structure and negotiation preferences." Larson studied her analysis, then began assigning roles for the response team. "Chen, you'll lead the primary negotiation team. Reyes will handle secondary communications. Patterson will coordinate with Turkish authorities. Martinez will manage media relations." Carla waited for her assignment, certain that her expertise on Sons of Ottoman Glory would make her essential to the operation. "Sir," she said carefully, "I've been tracking Sons of Ottoman Glory for 8 months. I know their psychological profiles, their internal power dynamics, their likely responses to different negotiation approaches. I could provide real-time analysis that might be crucial for successful resolution." Larson's expression softened slightly, but his decision remained firm. "Roberts, your analytical work is invaluable, but field operations require experience. Chen has handled 12 similar situations. The last thing we need is someone learning on the job when lives are at stake." "But sir, academic knowledge of the specific group involved might be more valuable than general negotiation experience." "Roberts." His tone carried a note of finality. "The decision is made. Prepare briefing materials for the field team. That's where you can contribute most effectively." As the senior team prepared for deployment to Ankara, Carla retreated to her workstation and began compiling everything she knew about Sons of Ottoman Glory. Their leader, Mehmet Kara, was a former university professor who'd radicalized after losing his position due to government purges. He considered himself an intellectual and responded positively to negotiators who demonstrated knowledge of Ottoman history and Islamic theology. His second-in-command, Aylan Demir, was a former military officer with PTSD from combat operations in Syria. She was prone to emotional outbursts but could be calmed through appeals to her sense of honor and duty to protect innocent life. The operational commander, Osman Yildiz, was the most dangerous member of the group, a sociopath who joined the organization for the opportunity to commit violence legally under the banner of ideology. Traditional negotiation approaches wouldn't be effective with him, but he could be marginalized by appealing to the religious sensibilities of the other members. Carla documented all of this in detailed briefing materials, along with specific communication strategies tailored to each individual. She identified cultural references that would resonate with the group, religious arguments that might appeal to their stated beliefs, and psychological pressure points that could be exploited to create divisions within their leadership. The briefing package she produced was the most comprehensive analysis the department had ever created for a single operation. It contained not just intelligence, but actionable recommendations based on deep understanding of the individuals involved. But she wouldn't be there to implement those recommendations. As the field team departed for Ankara, Carla watched from the operations center as Chen attempted to establish communication with the hostage takers.
The initial conversation was stilted and unproductive. Chen was using standard negotiation protocols that treated the attackers as generic terrorists rather than the specific individuals Carla had profiled. "He's using the wrong approach with Kara," she told the duty officer monitoring communications. "Kara responds to intellectual respect, not authority. Chen should reference Ottoman history or Islamic scholarship to establish credibility." The duty officer nodded politely but didn't relay the suggestion to the field team. Over the next 6 hours, Carla watched in growing frustration as the negotiation stalled. Chen was competent, but he was treating the situation as a standard hostage crisis rather than recognizing the unique psychological dynamics of Sons of Ottoman Glory. When Kara began quoting classical Arabic poetry, Chen missed the cultural significance entirely. "He's testing Chen's education level," she explained to anyone who would listen. If Chen responded with his own poetic reference, it would establish intellectual equality and open productive dialogue. But Chen continued with standard de-escalation techniques that were clearly ineffective against someone of Kara's psychological profile. By evening, the situation had deteriorated. The hostage-takers had executed one embassy employee and were threatening to kill another unless their demands were met within 24 hours. Chen was requesting backup negotiators and extended operational support. "Roberts," Larson called from the main operations desk, "I need updated analysis on potential outcomes. What are we looking at if this continues on the current trajectory?" Carla consulted her profiles and felt her stomach sink. "Sir, based on the psychological dynamics I've observed, we're approaching a critical decision point for the group's leadership. Kara is losing face because his intellectual superiority isn't being recognized. Demir is becoming increasingly agitated because she sees the situation as dishonoring the group's stated principles. And Yildiz is pushing for more violence because prolonged negotiation doesn't serve his needs. What's your assessment of their next move?" "If the current approach continues, they'll execute additional hostages within the next 12 hours, not because they're evil, but because their group dynamics are breaking down and violence is their only remaining option for maintaining internal unity." Larson was quiet for a long moment. "What would you recommend?" "Send someone who understands their specific psychology, someone who can speak to Kara as an intellectual equal, appeal to Demir's sense of honor, and marginalize Yildiz through religious arguments he can't counter." "We don't have anyone with that specific expertise available for immediate deployment." Carla took a deep breath. "Sir, we do." Larson looked at me with the same expression he'd worn dozens of times before, a mixture of sympathy and dismissal. "Roberts, you're not field qualified. This isn't a training exercise." "Then 12 people are going to die because I'm not tall enough to be taken seriously." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around the operations center, conversations quieted as staff realized what Carla had said. Larson's expression hardened. "That's enough, Roberts. Continue monitoring and analysis. The field team will handle operational decisions." Carla returned to her workstation, but she couldn't focus on intelligence updates. Somewhere in Ankara, 12 innocent people were counting on negotiators who didn't understand the psychology of their captors. And the one person who did understand was sitting in Brussels because she didn't look like someone who belonged in a crisis situation. She stared at her comprehensive profiles of Sons of Ottoman Glory members, knowing exactly what needed to be said and how to say it, but powerless to act on that knowledge. For the first time since joining the Crisis Management Division, Carla began to wonder if her colleagues were right. Maybe expertise without the authority to use it was just elaborate preparation for inevitable failure.
That night, Carla sat in her apartment, staring at intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. The Ankara situation was deteriorating, exactly as she'd predicted. Chen's traditional negotiation approach had failed to establish meaningful connection with the hostage-takers, and Turkish authorities were growing impatient with the EU's handling of the crisis. But instead of going to bed, Carla opened her laptop and began working on something she'd never admitted to anyone: For the past year, she'd been developing detailed negotiation scripts for every major terrorist organization in her database. Not just analytical profiles, but actual conversation flows designed to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities. The Sons of Ottoman Glory scripts filled 47 pages of carefully crafted dialogue trees. Carla had written opening statements designed to appeal to Kara's intellectual vanity, had composed religious arguments that would resonate with the group's stated beliefs, and had even prepared specific Ottoman historical references that would demonstrate cultural respect. Most importantly, she'd developed a strategy for isolating Yildiz, the violent sociopath whose influence was driving the group toward increased brutality. By appealing to Islamic principles of protecting innocent life and framing violence against civilians as contrary to true jihad, she could marginalize his voice within the group's decision-making process. These scripts weren't academic exercises. Carla had tested them through role-playing scenarios during Dr. Vasquez's workshops, had refined them based on psychological research, and had even validated some approaches through careful conversations with former extremists at the refugee center. She'd never shown these scripts to anyone at the Crisis Management Division. They represented thousands of unpaid hours, research that went far beyond her assigned duties. Her supervisors appreciated her intelligence briefings, but detailed negotiation strategies would be seen as overstepping her role. Now, as she read reports of the deteriorating situation in Ankara, those scripts felt like a lifeline that no one was willing to grasp. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Vasquez. "Saw the news about Ankara. This is exactly the kind of situation your Sons of Ottoman Glory analysis was designed for. Are you involved in the response?" Carla typed and deleted several responses before settling on intelligence support only. Field teams handle direct negotiation. The response came immediately. "That's insane. You know more about this group than anyone in Europe. You should be leading this operation, not supporting it." "Politics and procedures," Carla replied. "Politics and procedures are going to get those hostages killed. Sometimes you have to make your own opportunities." Carla stared at that message for a long time. Make your own opportunities. The phrase echoed something she'd heard Dr. Vasquez say during workshops about breakthrough moments in crisis negotiations. Sometimes the difference between success and failure was someone willing to act outside established protocols when lives were at stake. She opened a secure connection to the operational communications network using her intelligence credentials to monitor real-time traffic between Brussels and the field team in Ankara. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Chen had been negotiating for 18 hours without establishing meaningful rapport with any of the hostage takers. His most recent communication attempts had actually increased tensions, with Kara becoming increasingly agitated by what he perceived as cultural ignorance and intellectual condescension. The Turkish authorities were preparing for a tactical assault that would almost certainly result in massive casualties. The hostage-takers had consolidated their positions and were showing signs of preparing for a final confrontation rather than continued negotiation. Carla pulled up her negotiation scripts and began adapting them for the current situation. She identified specific phrases that Kara had used in recent communications, mapped them against her psychological profile, and crafted responses designed to de-escalate his emotional state while appealing to his intellectual pride. For Demir, she prepared arguments about honor and duty that would appeal to her military background while addressing her obvious psychological distress. For the group collectively, she had religious and historical references that would demonstrate respect for their stated beliefs while creating openings for productive dialogue. But having the right words was meaningless if she couldn't speak them. Carla made a decision that would either save 12 lives or end her career. She activated her secure communication link and began typing a detailed message to Chen, outlining specific negotiation strategies based on her psychological analysis of the hostage takers. The message was professional, respectful, and comprehensive.
It contained exactly the kind of tactical recommendations that could transform the situation from a violent standoff into a successful resolution. She attached relevant portions of her negotiation scripts, clearly labeled as psychological analysis rather than directive communication. Then she hesitated with her finger over the send button. Sending unsolicited tactical advice to a field team was a career-ending violation of protocol. Intelligence analysts don't give operational guidance to senior negotiators. She was supposed to provide information, not strategy. But 12 people were going to die if she followed protocol. Carla pressed send. The response came back within minutes, not from Chen, but from Director Larson. Roberts, your message has been received. Intelligence analysts do not give tactical guidance to field operations. Confine your communications to requested information only. This is a direct order. Carla stared at that message, feeling the familiar burn of dismissal. Her expertise was being rejected not because it was wrong, but because she didn't have the authority to share it. She looked at her negotiation scripts, at the detailed psychological profiles, at the specific strategies that could save those hostages, all of it useless because she was the wrong person with the right knowledge. Then she looked at her reflection in her laptop screen and saw something she'd never seen before. Not the junior analyst who followed orders and accepted limitations, but someone who had spent a year preparing for exactly this moment. Dr. Vasquez was right. Sometimes you had to make your own opportunities. Carla began gathering her equipment. If the crisis management division wouldn't use her expertise to save those hostages, she'd find another way to get it where it needed to be. She was about to discover that the distance between Brussels and Ankara was much shorter than the distance between following orders and saving lives.
The next morning brought escalating tensions both in Ankara and within the Crisis Management Division. Carla arrived at the office to find her security access had been temporarily restricted and her direct communication privileges with field operations had been suspended. Roberts, Director Larson called from his office before she'd even reached her workstation. A word. She followed him into his office, where he closed the door and activated the privacy screen, a clear indication that their conversation was being treated as a security matter. Your message to the field team last night was inappropriate, he began without preamble. Intelligence analysts don't provide tactical guidance to operational teams. That's not your role, and it's not your expertise. Sir, 12 people are going to die if we don't change our approach. I have specific knowledge about this terrorist group that could make the difference between success and failure. What you have, Larson replied coldly, is academic theory. Chen has real-world experience in 12 similar situations. He knows how to read people under pressure, how to project authority in crisis situations, how to make split-second decisions when lives hang in the balance. But he doesn't know Sons of Ottoman glory, Carla pressed. He's treating them like generic terrorists instead of recognizing their specific psychological dynamics. Larson leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that mixed concern with suspicion. Roberts, I need to ask you directly, how do you know so much about this particular group? Your intelligence reports on Sons of Ottoman glory are remarkably detailed, almost as if you have inside information. The question hit Carla like a physical blow. Sir, everything in my reports comes from open sources, academic research, and analytical deduction. I've been tracking multiple terrorist organizations as part of my duties. Tracking, yes, but your reports go far beyond tracking. You have personality profiles that read like personal acquaintance, operational insights that suggest direct knowledge, cultural references that imply extensive contact with their ideology. Carla felt her heart racing. I do thorough research, sir. I study everything available about groups that might threaten EU interests. Everything available doesn't explain the level of detail in your analysis. You know things about Kara's psychological state, about Demir's military background, about Yıldız's personal motivations that aren't in any official intelligence files. The implication was clear, though unstated. Her supervisors were beginning to wonder if her expertise came from sources that weren't entirely appropriate for an EU intelligence analyst. Sir, I've been studying these groups for over a year. I read academic papers, analyze intercepted communications, cross-reference open-source intelligence. My refugee center work has also provided cultural insights that inform my analysis. Refugee center work? That wasn't in your security clearance application. Carla realized her mistake immediately. Her volunteer work at the refugee center was perfectly legal and appropriate, but she'd never mentioned it during her security review because she hadn't thought it was relevant. Now it looked like she'd been concealing contact with populations that might include extremist sympathizers. It's volunteer work helping asylum seekers with paperwork and translation. Nothing classified, nothing that would compromise security protocols. But you've been having conversations with people from regions controlled by terrorist organizations, people who might have sympathies or connections that you're not aware of. Sir, these are families fleeing from terrorist control, not supporters of it. They're victims, not sympathizers. That's not for you to determine, Roberts. The fact that you've been conducting unofficial intelligence gathering without clearance raises serious questions about your judgment and your loyalties. The word loyalties hung in the air like an accusation. Carla realized that her dedication to understanding terrorist psychology was being reframed as potential sympathy for terrorist ideology. Director Larson, my loyalty to the European Union and to saving innocent lives is absolute. Everything I've done has been in service of that mission. Everything you've done has been outside the scope of your assigned duties and without proper authorization. The question is, why? Before Carla could respond, Larson's secure phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then his expression grew even more serious. The Turkish authorities are moving to a tactical assault in 6 hours, he told her after ending the call. The field team has been unable to establish productive dialogue, and the hostage-takers have threatened to execute additional prisoners. Carla felt desperation rising in her throat. Sir, please let me help. I know exactly what to say to these people. I can prevent those executions. What you can do, Larson replied firmly, is provide analytical support from Brussels while we investigate the extent of your unauthorized activities. Your security clearance is under review pending a full investigation of your intelligence gathering methods and potential conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest? An analyst who claims to understand terrorist psychology better than experienced field operatives raises questions about how that understanding was acquired. Until those questions are resolved, you're confined to basic analytical duties under direct supervision. Carla left Larson's office feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach. Her expertise was being treated as evidence of disloyalty. Her preparation was being reframed as suspicious activity. The very knowledge that made her valuable was now being used to question her trustworthiness. At her workstation, she found that her computer access had been further restricted. She could read incoming intelligence reports, but couldn't access her comprehensive database or communication systems. Someone would be monitoring her activities throughout the day. As she sat at her desk, pretending to review routine intelligence while actually calculating how to save 12 lives that her superiors had written off, Carla realized that she had reached a point of no return. She could accept the limitations her colleagues had placed on her, follow orders, and watch innocent people die while protecting her career, or she could risk everything on the belief that some things were more important than protocol. Her colleagues saw her dedication as suspicious, her expertise as potentially dangerous, her preparation as evidence of divided loyalties. But 12 families were waiting for news from Ankara, 12 innocent people whose lives depended on someone willing to act when others chose caution. Sometimes the difference between doing your job and doing what's right is the willingness to lose everything for people you've never met.
3 hours after Carla's dismissal from the Crisis Management Division, the situation in Ankara took a catastrophic turn. She learned about it through news reports while sitting in a Brussels cafe, trying to process the end of her career and figure out what came next. The breaking news alert appeared on her phone at 2:47 p.m. German embassy crisis, second hostage executed. Turkish authorities threaten immediate assault. Carla's hands trembled as she read the details. Mehmet Kara, the Sons of Ottoman Glory leader, had killed another embassy employee after negotiations had completely broken down. Chen's team had made a critical error, challenging Kara's intellectual authority in a way that triggered his narcissistic rage. Exactly the kind of mistake Carla had warned against in her unsolicited tactical recommendations. Her phone rang. Dr. Vasquez. "Are you watching the news?" Vasquez asked without preamble. "I just saw it. They're going to assault the building." "Which means everyone dies, the hostages, the terrorists, probably some of the assault team, all because your former colleagues were too proud to listen to someone who actually understood the situation." Carla closed her eyes, seeing the faces of the hostage family she'd watched on television. 12 people reduced to 10, soon to be 0 if Turkish forces stormed the embassy. "Elena, there's nothing I can do. I've been dismissed, my security clearance is revoked, and even if I tried to help, nobody would listen." "There's always something you can do if you're willing to take risks. The question is how much those lives mean to you." Before Carla could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Miss Roberts?" The voice was heavily accented, Middle Eastern. "I am calling from the German embassy in Ankara." Carla's blood went cold. "How did you get this number?" "I am one of the hostages. I convinced them to let me call because I told them you are someone who might understand our situation." "I don't understand. How do you know who I am?" "Because my brother, Mohammed, works at your refugee center in Brussels. He told me about the European woman who speaks perfect Arabic and knows more about Middle Eastern politics than most professors. When this crisis started, I remembered his stories." Carla looked around the cafe, suddenly feeling exposed. This conversation was definitely being monitored by multiple intelligence agencies. "Fatima, I can't help you. I'm not authorized to negotiate on behalf of any government." "These men, they are not like other terrorists. Their leader keeps talking about how the Europeans treat them like uneducated savages. He says the negotiator they sent doesn't understand Islam, doesn't respect their culture, doesn't know their history." "The negotiator is very experienced, but he doesn't speak Arabic like you do, and he doesn't know Ottoman poetry like you do." Carla felt her heart racing. "How do you know I know Ottoman poetry?" "Because Mohammed told me about the woman who helped his family by reciting verses from Yunus Emre when his daughter was having nightmares about Syria. He said you knew more classical Arabic literature than anyone he'd met in Europe." The conversation she'd had with Mohammed's family 6 months ago came flooding back. His daughter had been traumatized by her experiences in refugee camps, and Carla had used classical Islamic poetry to help calm her fears. It had been a small gesture, but apparently one that had been remembered. "Fatima, I can't help you. I'm not authorized to negotiate on behalf of any government. These men, they are willing to talk to someone who understands that they are not monsters. But this conversation cannot happen over telephone. If you are serious about preventing bloodshed, you must come here." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Come to Ankara. Enter a building controlled by armed terrorists. Risk everything on the belief that knowledge could triumph over violence. "Kara, I need to consider what you're asking." "Consider quickly, sister. When the sun sets, many people will die unless someone with wisdom can find another path." The line went dead, leaving Carla sitting in a Brussels cafe with a choice that would define the rest of her life.
The surrender happened at 7:43 p.m. local time, just 17 minutes before the scheduled Turkish assault. As Carla led Kara, Yildiz, and their companion through the embassy's main entrance with their hands raised, dozens of cameras captured the moment when academic theory became operational reality. Colonel Erdogan approached with visible skepticism, flanked by heavily armed Special Forces soldiers. "You convinced them to surrender." "They convinced themselves," Carla replied, "but they have conditions that I strongly recommend you consider." "You are not authorized to negotiate conditions." "I'm not negotiating. I'm advocating for solutions that prevent future violence. These men have legitimate grievances that can be addressed through dialogue rather than persecution. The next 6 hours tested every diplomatic skill Carla had developed, and several she invented on the spot. Turkish authorities were reluctant to grant any concessions to terrorists who had killed 2 innocent people. European Union officials were furious that she had conducted unauthorized negotiations that created diplomatic complications. But the hostages were alive, and international media was already framing the resolution as a triumph of intelligent negotiation over brute force. Dr. Vasquez arrived in Ankara on the first available flight, bringing with her a team of lawyers and diplomatic contacts who could help navigate the complex legal and political implications of Carla's actions. "You did something impossible," Vasquez told her during a brief break in the interrogations. "You proved that psychological insight and cultural knowledge can resolve situations that traditional approaches cannot. I also proved that institutions will always choose conformity over competence. The Crisis Management Division has made it clear that I'll never work in crisis negotiation again." Who says you need to work for the Crisis Management Division? 3 months later, Carla stood in a conference room at the United Nations headquarters in New York, addressing an audience of international crisis negotiators about the Ankara resolution. Her presentation was titled "Cultural Psychology in Counter-Terrorism: Moving Beyond Generic Approaches." The room was packed with professionals who had previously dismissed her as an inexperienced academic. Now they were taking notes on her methodologies and requesting copies of her psychological profiling databases. The fundamental error in most hostage negotiations is treating all extremists as identical. We use the same approaches for religious fanatics, political separatists, and mentally disturbed individuals. But each group requires different psychological strategies based on their specific motivations and cultural contexts. Director Larson was in the audience, having flown from Brussels specifically to hear her presentation. During the question period, he stood up with obvious discomfort. "Ms. Roberts, your success in Ankara was remarkable, but it was also incredibly dangerous. How do you respond to critics who say you succeeded despite your inexperience, not because of it?" Carla smiled, recognizing the question as an attempt to diminish her achievement. "Director Larson, I would say that experience without understanding is just repetition of previous mistakes. The Ankara situation required someone who understood Sons of Ottoman Glory specifically, not someone who had generic experience with other terrorist groups." "But what if you had been wrong? What if your psychological assessment had been incorrect?" "Then 10 innocent people would have died, just as they would have under the traditional assault approach. The difference is that my approach offered hope for success, while the assault approach guaranteed casualties." After the presentation, Carla was approached by representatives from several international organizations, offering positions that would utilize her specialized knowledge. The UN Counterterrorism Office wanted her to develop psychological profiling protocols. NATO's Crisis Response Division offered her a senior analyst position. Even the CIA had expressed interest in her cultural negotiation methodologies. But the offer that interested her most came from Dr. Vasquez herself. "I'm starting a private consulting firm specializing in complex crisis negotiations. We would work with governments and international organizations on situations that require specialized psychological and cultural expertise. Are you interested in being a founding partner?" Carla thought about the offer while walking through Central Park that evening. For the first time in her life, she was being offered opportunities that matched her capabilities rather than limiting them. 6 months after Ankara, the Vasquez-Roberts Crisis Consulting Group had successfully resolved 4 major international incidents using the psychological profiling and cultural negotiation methods Carla had developed. Their success rate was unprecedented, and their client list included governments and organizations that had previously relied on traditional approaches. Carla's comprehensive terrorist organization database had become the foundation for a new field of crisis psychology that treated each situation as unique rather than generic.
Her negotiation scripts were being studied in universities and adapted by professional negotiators worldwide. But the most satisfying moment came when she received a handwritten letter from Fatima al-Rashid, who had returned to her family in Brussels after the Ankara crisis. "Dear Ms. Roberts," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for not just saving our lives, but for showing us that some people are willing to risk everything for strangers. My brother Muhammad still talks about the European woman who knew more about Islamic poetry than most imams. He says you proved that knowledge builds bridges while ignorance builds walls." Standing in her new office overlooking the East River that evening, Carla reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed analyst to international expert. The people who had once considered her too small, too young, too inexperienced were now requesting her consultation on their most difficult cases. The transformation was complete. But it had never really been about proving others wrong. It had been about proving that preparation, knowledge, and determination could overcome any limitation that others tried to impose. Her secure phone rang, indicating another crisis somewhere in the world where someone needed exactly the kind of understanding that couldn't be learned from textbooks or accumulated through generic experience. Carla Roberts smiled and answered the call, ready to prove once again that the person everyone underestimates is often exactly who you need when the impossible becomes necessary.